Mahi Malladi. I use she, her pronouns. I go to the Overlake School in Redmond, Washington, and I'm 18 years old. And before I get into the ins and outs of legislation, I want to jump into what my background is. So when people ask me who I am, I say I'm Mahi Malladi, like I just said, she, her pronouns, and I consider myself an advocate. And if you Google my name, you'll see all these photos that are coming up on this slide right now. The internet will tell you I've been to the White House twice this year. I've made it to the Seattle Times twice this year. I've joked around with our president and passed a law, like I explained before, allowing us to study in libraries without the threat of firearms. And if you ask Google, I have credibility to be giving this presentation because of everything I just listed here. But I don't think that's the reason that I was invited to do this presentation. Google can only tell you so much about me, and I can tell you only so much about myself, too. There are limitations of the English language prevent me from explaining my whole identity. And one of those things, next slide please, is that I am also a very avid bench warmer on my school's basketball team. And the reason I mention that is because that's also a very big part of my identity, less active, because again, I'm on the bench. But my identity, again, is more than the limitations of the English language. When I introduced myself, I was catering to you guys as my audience. I wanted to earn your respect and impress you guys, so that's why I started out with this. And that's a big part of my presentation today, is talking about what audience means. And my safe space isn't on the basketball court, it isn't in the testimonies I create, or in the education I promote. My safe space is in myself. And that's very cliche, but it's cliche for a reason. The reason I mention this is, starting off with my introduction, with my ethos and my credibility, is because I think that our generation, if you're a student, you know that humbleness has often become synonymous with silence. And the reason I take the opportunity to talk about myself and come to events like this and share my LinkedIn, follow me, don't, that's okay. But the reason I do this is because my identity markers counteract my achievements. And what that means is that when you grow up in a system and in a country that rewards assimilation, how can you not resent yourself for being a short, neurodiverse teenager of color who got a bad score on the SAT and is also a bench warmer? What I mean by is that there are always facets of our identities that are gonna disparage you, that are gonna prevent you from achieving the accomplishments that you wanna do in life, but that's not a reason not to talk about yourself. Not just on stage, but in everything that you do, in the advocacy you do, in the education you promote. Like I said before, my safe space is not in the things I mentioned before, especially not on the basketball court, because I'm on the sidelines. But I like to think about how I exist. Not just in my life as an 18-year-old, but in all that I represent. Because after all, you exist in the context. And that context is that you live in a system that has, since the inception of this country, created systems to exclude us. Not just us as people of color, but in everything that we do. We're expected to be perfect. And that's why I introduced myself as such, right? I hope I earned your respect, not just with my disparaging basketball jokes, but because I think I deserve it, not because I've been to the White House twice, but because I exist in who I am, with my bad jokes, and in my flaws and in my achievements. Our identities are multifaceted because we are living history. And we're made up of the successes and the challenges and love of our ancestors, and we barely recognize the strength that we have. And that begins with the genetic strength we have just in existing. We exist despite everyone and everything telling us not to. And that's because we're the products of unjust history and future optimism. And I made that quote, and I'll say it again because I really like it. We're the products of unjust history and future optimism. And in this life, you live in a world with the two eyes someone planted in your head, and that allows you to live with a perspective that I couldn't even begin to imagine, that other people can't even fathom. And that in itself, even if your LinkedIn is impact, which LinkedIn should not be the status quo, that is enough. And you know more than you think, because existing as yourself is an act of defiance. And I like to think success starts with that. Success starts with just existing, with your flaws and your achievement, and if anything else, that's what you contribute. just living. Because think about all the things that have told you you're not supposed to, starting with yourself, with all the factors of life that you're supposed to assimilate to. And that's enough. So I encourage you to find strength in yourself, but also in your people. And that can range from the racial group you're a part of, in your gender, in your sexuality, in your neighborhood, your community, and in your nationality, but especially in the human race. We're all here because we survived the pandemic, because we had the ability to drive here, to be here, to talk to each other in English. And I like to think that we exist on a spectrum, as the human race. And there are two parts of this: the things that you do to survive, and the things that other people do to survive. Is this on? Okay, cool. I didn't know if it was. Like I said, there are two things that, within this spectrum, the things you do to survive and the things other people do to survive. When we're born, we live entirely in the first part. You do everything just to survive. But for me, I've made it to the point of where my selfishness has allowed me to advocate for other people. And if it starts with selfishness, let that be. We don't always have to be altruistic. We don't have to do everything in the greater good. Advocating for yourself, living for yourself, is more than enough. It doesn't feel that way, but I like to think that it is. In my identity, I see myself as a curious American and English speaker, and I see myself as a vessel for justice for other people. And with that identity comes a responsibility of keeping injustice in my periphery, constantly looking around for the things that are injustice towards you, because you have your perspective. Speak from that. You don't need to go out and make a change that doesn't pose such a big burden to you. Start with yourself. And I like to say that your existence is in defiance to assimilative structures. Existing is enough, like I said before. But simply existing is also a form of privilege. And that doesn't mean you have to indulge in apathy and abstain from seeking justice, because you're sitting on power just by being who you are. But I'd like to say, amidst all of this empowerment, inspiration I'm hoping you're taking from this, next slide please, we live in a government that's an elitist government. And my gov teacher explains this as a government that, I can't read that, a theory of government and politics contending that an upper-class elite will hold most of the power and thus, in effect, run the government. And that means a small portion of the government has so much decision-making power that can rule our lives. And the reason I include the Supreme Court is that you might have heard this summer, a little bit ago, of the Roe v. Wade decision, which gave states back the power on whether or not abortions are legal in their state. It's not a federal decision anymore. And the reason I bring this up is because Supreme Court decisions can be reversed, but they so rarely happen. It takes a majority, and it takes a lot of time, and it's, frankly, very, very difficult to get past. This is an example of an elitist government. And we're victims of a system of an elitist government. So all this I just said, of your existence meaning something, doesn't feel like it does, because, again, we live in a society in which the decision-making is in our hands. So what can you do with such little power? And my response to this is that you do what you can and you hope that's enough. And I have an anecdote for this. This happened about 4 years ago when I was in 8th grade. And this was during the pandemic, so we had an online school, and I was in physics class, and I hate physics, I still do. And because of that, I was going through the textbook that we had that was published by McGraw-Hill. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because they're one of the big 3 publishing companies in the United States for education. So during that time, I was bored, I was going through the textbook, and I realized, even as a very ignorant, 10-year-old, that of all the models in the book, the boys and the girls only wore 3 colors: pink, blue, and purple. And it was very obvious that in this big, thick textbook that I didn't even read, that all the girls were wearing, all the feminine presenting women were all wearing pink, blue, and purple. But none of the male models were wearing pink. And I thought that was weird, so someone should do something about that. So I Googled it, and no one was doing anything about that. Why would you? We live in a capitalist society in which everything has monetary value. If there's no reason to make a change, why do it? So what I did is I ended up taking out pink and blue Sharpies and writing this really snarky letter to New York, They ended up responding a month later saying, I'm so sorry, we're going to make a change, we're going to make a difference. They didn't. So that's an example of I did what I could with my power, and that was with my Sharpies, and a change wasn't made. But I did what I could, and that's enough. Especially for youth, we can't vote. We can't do anything but live and talk. And that's enough. Next slide, please. So the impact of living in a capitalist society is that your value is entirely dependent on what you provide others. You go to work because you have skills, and you get paid for your skills, whether that be skills you learned in college or simply being a cashier. If you are, I'm sorry, I know that's a hard job. So what I encourage you to recognize is that you benefit from systems in communities, but you can also benefit from what you're doing for yourself. And this goes back to what I was talking about selfishness. Your advocacy can start from a place of trying to represent yourself. And I'll tell you a little story that kind of connected to what I was saying on the panel before. This was about 3 years ago. I was taking my AP exam for the AP Art History exam, and I hadn't studied, so I was studying the night before really hard. And I get an email at midnight from my school saying there's a bomb threat at my local high school that my sister went to, and school is canceled for the day. And my first reaction wasn't texting my sister, wasn't texting my best friend who went to RHS, Redmond High School. It was saying, yay, oh my God, I get more time to study. And my memory from that isn't that I got a 5 on the exam, which is, I'm proud of that too. But my memory from that is that I felt such a lack of apathy. But that's not a bad thing. Like I said before, we're reflections of a society that instills our value on just being vessels of monetary achievement. That's all we're expected to be in a society. But you can have higher expectations for yourself. And that starts with, again, I'm going to keep coming back to this point of your existence is enough, because we're not told that enough. You living is in defiance to everything. Everything in this world, whether that be natural disasters, whether that be COVID, or yourself thinking that you're not worthy of the achievements and the job and the family that you have. So that apathy I felt from the story I just said is a result of the desensitization to the deaths of my peers. But that guilt led me to being an advocate. That led me down to Olympia, where I ended up testifying. That photo was taken the day that I helped testify on behalf of SB 5444, which is the bill I was talking about that prevents firearms from being allowed into zoos, aquariums, transit centers, and libraries. And this is, the reason I bring this up is that success and advocacy can start from anywhere. Success isn't linear. Your existence isn't linear. It's not unexpected, because you are the result of everything that has happened in the past. Again, I'll say my quote, you are the product of unjust history and future optimism. And the reason I bring up testimonies is that we live in an elitist government, which you now know the definition of. And one of the only forms of power in an elitist government is testimonies. And the Washington State Legislature defines that as oral or written statements, documents, or any other material that may be offered by a witness in an official proceeding. Which means that in Olympia, you can go down there and testify on your perspective on a bill that's being passed, or online during Zoom during lunch, which is what I often do during the school day. And Washington State has one of the best systems of allowing people to testify. As an American citizen, you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to have power, and you're allowed to use that power. So, this is my encouragement to get your foot in the door, because the door has been closed for us for so long. If any of you have testified, you know how difficult it is to testify. Like I said before, you're constantly thinking as a person about your audience. Like when I'm speaking to you guys, I'm trying to use jargon to sound fancy. And when I'm speaking to my family, I try to speak with a tone of love. It doesn't always come off that way, but that's what I try to do. And when you're testifying, your audience are officials who care almost exclusively about monetary benefits. Your existence to them isn't enough, despite what I'm telling you right now and despite what the Washington State Legislature is telling you on this website. So when you're testifying, you're speaking from a perspective that is your human right. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, logistically, when you're down in Olympia testifying, bills are constantly being proposed in both chambers, in the Senate and in the House. And you, starting in January, have the opportunity to testify constantly on any bill of your choice, whether that be gun violence prevention. And on that example there, we see that there's going to be legislation about the standard of wood stoves. So if you're really passionate about that, go for it. We need more standards, I suppose. And also one of the benefits, like I said before, is that as a human, you have the right to respect. And what that means is that you have the right to have your perspective respected, and also other people. So when I'm down in Olympia, the 4 times I've been there, I was the only student in the room, and I was the only person of color. Obviously the only woman of color there too. There were police officers, members of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, that called me and my friends Nazis for trying to prevent gun violence that ended up killing one of her best friends. Like I said, this goes back to your existence isn't enough in the eyes of the government, but this means that you have to do what you can to earn that respect. So when you're down there, you'll hear perspectives from the NRA, from police officers, from victims of systems that produce victims and perpetrators, from business owners, officials, and parents. Your name isn't up there, but it definitely could be in January. And I just want to end off this presentation by saying that the fear you will inevitably experience as a person living in a society, like I said, that tries to prevent your existence, is something that I think is beneficial. That your pain that you've experienced as a person living in the identity you carry can be beneficial. Like I said before, I'm always asking myself, why? Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to skip school, miss my test, get a bad grade on my test to testify down in Olympia on common sense gun laws? And like I said before, my answer to that is, why not? Why not me? Why not you? It's a 2-minute testimony. Next slide, please. Yes. You, like I said before, sorry, is that you will feel scared because you're making yourself vulnerable by searching for justice. And I really like this quote, because fear is almost always a byproduct of you doing something out of the ordinary, out of the status quo. Next slide, please. So when you're promoting testimonies, when you're producing testimonies with an audience that you have to be very cognizant of, you have to think about, what do I know that other people don't? You're a human with unique experiences. What can you do in a society that ostensibly doesn't care about that? So, what do you know? What do you care about, and why should I care about that? Why should these officials care about that? You matter, but you don't matter that much, is their opinion. And examples of laws that you can testify on include gun violence prevention, education, race-based laws, zoning laws, construction, housing, laws about anything and everything. Because laws govern our lives, and our audience in society is almost often the law. Allow yourself to be that audience once in a while. Let yourself be respected in the eyes of yourself. And be a little selfish. Next slide, please. So thanks. That's my email if you want to tell me anything. And also, you should have been passed out a piece of paper that explains a little bit more in depth the process of, maybe not, I will pass out the papers, the process of legislation, and also quotes that I hope you take away. Even when you're not testifying, you are deserving of respect just by being yourself. Your existence is a privilege. So act like that a little bit. And the only difference between you and me up on this stage and you listening to me give this presentation is that I made the effort. See you in Olympia.
Mahi, do you have time for questions, or would you like to take questions?
Yeah, no, questions for sure.
Okay. So I have a question, which is, like, how do you even find out opportunities to testify? Because you mentioned the different topics that we could testify on, but how do we plug in?
How did I begin testifying, or how can you?
Yeah. How should people plug in to finding out what's going on?
You got that piece of paper? There's gonna be a link at the very bottom of that. Can someone confirm that? There should be a link. Okay, perfect. That is a link that you're gonna go to, and it's gonna tell you all the laws that you could testify on. Starting in January, it is gonna be packed. Right now it's not because the legislative session hasn't started, but I've seen so many people from doctors like in the operating room or outside or something testifying on that. So offer up your perspective and see that link for when January comes. So that is my little plug to get involved.
Anyone else have any questions before I ask another one? Oh, Dave.
So I'm curious, at your school, has there ever been a class where a class assignment was to testify?
No.
Do you think that would be a good idea?
I think that would be an amazing idea. I also think there is a lot of effort that goes into writing these testimonies. A lot of it is personal, right? And I think that's the experience of students, right? You're told, like I said before, I got a bad score on the SAT. College, please accept me. But when you're students, that's all that seems to matter. So you said you were a board member? Yeah. So I think that would be a great idea of that. That is a direct way of showing students that their existence matters more than standardized testing. I like that thought because I'm not great at standardized testing. But to answer your question, yes, I think that would be amazing. And I think students are often told that their entire value is just on paper. And that's just simply not true, despite what the internet tells you about you mattering so much.
Great. We got a question over here from Khalid.
Okay. I've only started recently advocating for the past year. So my quick question is, have you ever had to deal with people who are frustratingly ignorant, like to a point for, it's not just, ignorance, it's not just being ignorant that they just don't know, but more like ignorant as in they're just, it goes in one ear out the other, just openly victim blaming, just being the kind of people who just cannot catch up with the times.
Yes. So the question was, have you ever experienced someone that is just so very intentionally ignorant? And that's something I think about a lot, is willful ignorance. I think in our identities, we have parts of our identities that are marginalized. Of course, right? That's why we're here at this conference, is because we know that part of our identity and we care about that. But there are also parts of our identities that we take for granted. And that willful ignorance, I think, is one of the biggest challenges of being human. So, yes, those people are very frustrating, but I am also one of those people. And I try to combat that by talking to people with different perspectives and setting aside my own values for a minute, just to listen. Because like I said, the right to be respected is a human right, at least in my eyes.
Okay, thank you. One more question. How do you tell the difference between somebody who's like willfully ignorant and just actually ignorant? Like, they never admit it, they never own up to it, and they can't really like victim blame, and they tend to just, try to pass blame towards you or gaslight you. How do you combat that without losing your cool?
That's a great question. So how do you combat sort of people that very intentionally and like to victim blame? And sometimes the answer is that you can't. You can't change people's opinions, and sometimes it's not even worth trying that. Because your existence in itself, like I keep on saying, I'm sorry if this is a little bit repetitive, but that is enough, and you know your perspective, and that's enough to you. Right? You can say it to the people who matter, and that, to me, is down in Olympia.
Okay, my own theory when it comes to these kinds of beliefs is that these people have their own images of themselves that are born from this elitist type of government, and anything that's a threat to that, no matter how illogical it is something they'll defend throughout, no matter what. It's not like growing up in a sexist society, a patriarchy, and because you're a guy, you feel there's inherent superiority, and anything that challenges that, you instinctively reject. How do you feel about that?
I think that, so the question was, how do I feel about living in a society that very much prioritizes the patriarchy and makes people feel like if they're treated well, they're deserving of it?
Yes.
Well, I'm here on stage, and I don't love that belief that we seem to have. But again, ego is, I think, inherent to the human experience. So that is my take on that, and that people are deserving of grace, even if it doesn't seem like it. They have their experiences, and their opinions derive from that. Hope that answered your question.
Any other questions before I ask another one? Okay, so yeah, so building on that idea of being in spaces that are not necessarily welcoming, how do you navigate that for yourself? Do you have like a mantra or I don't know, some sort of like internal script that you tell yourself to stay positive, even though you might be in a situation where you are being called names, like you mentioned with the people calling you, you were just trying to advance gun safety, but the NRA and other folks were not being very nice.
great question. I'm still trying to find my mantra to that. And I think something that I try to remember is that I don't have to be the only one doing this. This is a plug for the Washington Youth Alliance. We're starting our legislation, promoting legislation in January. So that is a way of joining a group of people that really respect you and respect the ideals that you have. It's also worth noting that your priorities are different. In your identities that you have, we all prioritize different experiences and perspectives. To me, developing my identity was the biggest priority in my life for the last couple of years and took precedence over grades and everything else in my life. And the NRA I'm just gonna generalize here and say that their priority is honoring their First Amendment rights. My priority is just wanting to live. And it's not up to me to convince them. My job is to do what I can with the little power I have and hope that's enough. And it's frustrating being called names for simply wanting to live your life the way that you're doing it. But don't name call yourself, right? Go on TikTok a little bit, scroll a little bit. Don't burn yourself out. Existing in your identity authentically with your flaws and your achievements is exhausting. It's exhausting to not constantly want to assimilate. And that's why being enough. And let that be enough. Easier said than done. I'm still working on it, but I hope that helped a little bit.
Yeah, it's a journey for all of us, not just you. So I appreciate that. Yes, Kenji.
Mahi, what advice, I guess, would you give those of us in the room, organizational reps, adults, the people with, more civic power than the youth in the room, to make sure that you, one, have the tools to do what you're doing, but also are not the only one doing it and not doing it by yourself?
That's a great question. And for the educators in the room, which I know there's a couple of you, I think the occupation you've decided to pursue is very indicative of you prioritizing altruism in your life. And that's very impressive. So thank you for that first and foremost. And I think also giving students the grace and the space to make mistakes. Like I said before, we're a reflection of our society. And that means we have biases and we'll say bad things because that's what we've been groomed and bred to reproduce and say that stuff. So giving us a little grace about what we say, what we think, but also giving us that space to make mistakes and realize that that's the human experience. It's a survivorship curve to go from that place of prioritizing your ability to survive and doing everything you can to do that to helping others survive. And I think that shift happens when you're a student in school. So as adults, it's hard to say be an inspiration to other people, but you being yourself in your mistakes, in the flaws that you have, in the things that you've said and done that were wrong, that is inspiration to students like us. We make mistakes. I've gotten in trouble for saying wrong things, but that doesn't make me any less perfect. And I respect myself even more for learning from it. At least I hope I have. So I hope that answers your question a little bit, Kenji. Do we have a little bit time left or no?
Yeah, we actually could probably go another 5 minutes if we want.
Okay. So I was hoping to have a piece of paper of you. I was hoping to lead a little workshop about writing a testimony. And if you want, you can go ahead and reuse this testimony in January. But I want to give you guys a little bit of time. And if you would like my advice in doing so, please go for it.
Yeah, let's go for it.
So first, like I said before, you're going to think of a topic that matters to you. And on that sheet of paper you have, Kenji very kindly provided an outline of how you are supposed to testify. So use your experience, benefit from the pain that you've experienced and living in your authentic identity, and recognize the audience that you're talking to, and write a little testimony. So I'll walk around and I'll talk to you guys and help you workshop a little bit. Does that sound good? Okay, cool.
All right. Well, for everyone who's in the room here, we're welcome to have lunch. Mahi, thank you again for a great session. Really appreciate the individual one-on-one coaching at the end on how to write testimony. That was fabulous. And yeah, excellent job, and I appreciate everything that you bring.